I haven't done a painting challenge in a while, so I'm about to leave the best advice out the door and see what it's like to paint in miniature without thinning paints at all. We all know the rules, right? Thin your paints, because if you don't... But surely the difference between painting perfection and sculpting with acrylics can't just be that little bit of moisture. As someone that paints with heavy body paints, I'm used to thick paint. That normal Vallejo from the bottle can seem pretty dang thin already. So can I get away with not thinning at all? As a side note, I don't plan on doing anything fancy painting wise, so I'm not expecting a great result in the final model. It's more about how it feels and how it goes on than how it looks in the end. For this challenge, I'm going to have to set down some ground rules, because I feel like the hardest part is going to be stopping my muscle memory from just thinning the paint without thinking about it at all. Rule 1 is around wet palette usage. I need a wet palette. My climate is so dry that if I try and paint on a normal palette, it gives me no working time at all. So I will need a wet palette just so the paint gets back some of the moisture it loses. But if I were to close the palette and come back to it, that would have thinned the paint. So the rule is going to be that all paint that hits the model has to be fresh. So if I ever close my wet palette to take a break, when I come back, I have to put out fresh paint so that it's always from the bottle consistency. I'm also not allowed to play with the paint on the palette, as doing so draws out moisture, so I might have to do my mixes on a dry surface and just leave the raw colors on the palette. For the brushes, bristles just need moisture to work, so there's always going to be some moisture. So to minimize how much it affects the paint, I'll be using a tissue to wick out before filling the brush with the paint. Lastly, no inks or washes or contrasts. These kinds of paints are meant to be thin, so if I mix them with normal acrylics, I feel like that would be a cheat and kind of void the whole premise, so I'm just not going to use them. As for the model, it's the start of the Vampiric Undead this month on the One Page Rules Patreon. As it wouldn't be vampiric without a vampire, of course I'm going to go with the vampire. Though as is traditional for the first month of an army, there's also the main soldiers. But it's also not vampires without some bat swarms and their much larger cousin, the Bat Beast. Get all this and more on the One Page Rules Patreon, a link in the description. As a litmus test, I think I want to start with what I think is going to be the hardest part to paint, and that's his face. So many facial features get lost with thick coats, so if it doesn't work here, then at least I can try and do better on the larger parts. I'm starting with a Chimera Red Oxide. This one starts thinner than my heavy bodies, so I'm hoping it can give me a thin enough first surface for the skin to go over. Because I won't be able to wash or glaze without the ability to thin paint, I think my only course of action to get a buildup of color will have to be layering. But the more steps I take, the thicker the layers, which is also bad. A conundrum. So I'm going to put on my chaps and hat and be a cowboy about it, taking the colors used to mix into my brush, then mix it on the tissue directly. I'll start with something I hope turns out darker, but paint whatever comes out as the result as the first layer. I'm actually alright if this does end up a bit bright, as vampires are pretty pale anyway, and I'll just make sure to leave only the darkest of the shadows as pure red oxide. Even though I'm not thinning anything, paint has its own transparency, and I'm sure once dry, this won't be as bright as it looks. So I was wrong. The thing about painting with unthinned paint is it's at its max opacity, so the color shift was minimal, and it's already starting to get thick, so all those other layers I had planned, well, they're out the window, and I'm just going to go right to my lightest color. I'm going to try and dab it in the important spots like the cheeks and nose, maybe the upper lip if I can get paint on it. So this isn't going as well as my imagination promised me it would. Trying to paint my normal way where I fill my brush and wick it off on tissue is making it really hard for the paint to come off the brush as it dries fast in the bristles, which means as it does come off, it has a lot of texture to it. It can't be good for my bristles either, I'm sure. So as far as a litmus test goes, I've learned a lot here. And I don't know that I like those lessons. Can I change my game plan? Okay, so if the paint isn't stroking on as well as I had hoped, what's my next option? How about just using the model itself as the palette? Why don't I just blend it on the model instead for a single layer? And I'll try and do some non-metal metal with a dark black blue and a light gray, using my gray primer as that gray since it is a bit thinner. So the good news is that mixing on the model feels much nicer on my brush, like it's not going to ruin it. And since I'm wet blending, the lighter color is higher up in the brush, which means it stays wet longer and can be used to highlight the edges after filling in the shadows with the thicker, darker paint. So I can get most of the base and highlight done in one layer, reducing my overall thickness. Though I think the thinner gray paint is doing most of the work here to make it possible. With two heavy body paints, it might have a harder time actually creating the mix, but most miniatures paint lines would be more fluid like this anyway. And being able to add more paint to my brush to do the loaded brush meant I was at least always adding some moisture back to the tip in the form of fresh paint, so I wasn't having the same issues of paint not flowing. There was a tiny benefit to the paint being thick as well, so it wasn't all bad, and that's because it didn't really flow into the cracks and crevices. I'd end up with some black lining where it couldn't get in to cover the black primer. So I got some free shadowing to go along with the blends, which is always nice. Now this doesn't look all that, let's say, neat. Okay, it's chaos, but I think I can use a pure gray to do all my touch-ups and outlines to make it a little nicer. I'll have to put some more out on the palette though, and I'd like to say it was because I closed the lid and let it sit, but the truth is that by not thinning the paint, I have to use way more of it, always reloading my brush, so there just wasn't any left on the palette. But that is good news for actually painting. Because this stuff takes longer to dry, I can actually get these edges with some cleaner lining, though I do have to go back often. Before I try anything else, I just want to remind everyone that my Patreon is free to join, where you can get updates on things I'm working on. And while there, check out the store to find packs that include painting videos, but also the STL used in them, so it's easy to paint along. I want to try one more thing to see if it makes it any easier on me, and that's to use a much larger brush. This flathead should be able to hold a bit more paint, but also do the blending right in the bristles instead of on the model. So I'm hoping it can give me a more even one coat coverage. I'll use some Chimera Warm Yellow as my light color, since it might be more fluid, and some Burnt Umber for my brown. Since the mixing is going to be in the brush, they just go on the palette. I may have done something really silly here in that I kind of forgot I was going over a black primer, so the yellow isn't going to cover very well. But because it's not thinned, I at least get the full density of the pigments behind it. Otherwise though, I'm just wet blending streaks of brown and yellow alternating over this halo. And again, because of that yellow, I have to do a second layer. It's just not organized enough for that single coat to be fixed with something like outlining. So a second wet blending just to at least blend out all those blends a little more blendy-like. So it's not a perfect yellow at the moment, but I think that will work out in my favor actually, since I can use the pure yellow to do my outlines. Thereby not having to mix anything, I can keep using the thinner Chimera Yellow. And if these outlines come out thick, that's alright because it just covers up more of the duller yellow under it. So this method worked alright, but it needs a large surface to actually work on. Alright, I'm going to take one more punt and try and give myself the best chance at this. starting with this, a humidifier. It should at least put some moisture in the air around my painting desk so that a paint will last a little longer. And I'll break these out of storage, Vallejo airbrush paints, so they should be nice and thin to start with, even though they're satin. I'll grab some Ascending Reds and see if I can't get this cape done. I'll start with just the dark red and a large brush. I'm not going to be doing the wet blending for this because I learnt my lesson with the yellow. Trying to get the light red to cover the black is just going to give me a headache. So I'll sacrifice a layer for the red base instead. But I'll use the large flat brush again because that worked before. Now I'll try a different type of wet blending. Instead of having two paint colors in the bristles, I'll instead just dip one side into it and leave the rest clear. There's not a lot of moisture in the brush, so this might be a bad move, but I hope I can feather it off a little bit at least. The good news is the red's transparent, so even at full strength, it should naturally blend. And the airbrush paint really is quite thin from the bottle, though certainly not ink or wash thin either. For my last little quick highlight layer, I used a normal brush again just to see what the airbrush paint would be like with it, and it does feel a little more normal. It actually flows from my bristles, and the moisture in the air stops it from drying out too much. Which, if there's one thing to take away from this challenge, it's the reason that we thinned the paint in the first place. And that reason, and why thinning is so second nature to me normally, is because it gives us control. Other than washes and glazes where the idea is to thin out the pigments, for the most part we only want to thin out paint so that we have perfect control of it, so that it flows from the brush, so that it sits on the model where we put it, and so that it dries flat without a texture, so that more layers can be easily added. It's why I think a saying like thin your paints is meaningless without the context of what that's actually doing, why it's helping, and what you're even looking for, and why it can be really hard for new painters to pick up. Because there's no perfect ratio for thinned paint, like 2 drops paint to 1 drop water. The perfect ratio is the one that gives you the most control, with the most pigment. If you liked this video, please subscribe, and if you'd like to support my channel, check out my Patreon where I have new models and videos each month for you to print and paint.